There is a rock in the North Atlantic 20 miles from the nearest coast. No harbor, no shelter. Just black cliffs and the sea and the wind. In the year 1900, 3 men lived on that rock. Their only job was to keep a light burning. On the night of December the 15th, a passing steamer looked for that light and found only darkness. 11 days later, a relief boat fought its way out to the island. They blew the whistle. They fired a flare. Nothing answered. When they finally climbed to the Lighthouse, the door was shut. The clock had stopped. The rooms were cold. And of the 3 men who lived there was no sign at all. No bodies, no boat, no note that made any sense. Just an empty light at the edge of the world. The lamp had been cleaned. The wicks had been trimmed. It was ready to be lit by hands that never came back. 3 experienced men do not simply vanish from a locked lighthouse. And yet these 3 did. And more than a century later, we still cannot tell you how. This is the mystery of the Flannan Isles. I dig into a new, unexplained case every single week. If the things we cannot explain keep you up at night, subscribe and tap the bell, so the next one finds you in the dark. First, you have to understand the place itself, because the place is half the story. The Flannan Isles sit off the west coast of Scotland, beyond the Isle of Lewis, out in the Outer Hebrides. 7 small islands, scattered across open ocean, with nothing beyond them but the Atlantic. Sailors did not call them the Flannans, they called them the 7 Hunters. 7 bare rocks with no trees, no soil to speak of, no people, and a long, uneasy reputation. The islands take their name from St. Flannan, an Irish holy man from more than 1,000 years ago. On the largest island, there are still the ruins of a tiny stone chapel he is said to have used, a rough, roofless cell of piled stone. The locals called it the Blessing House. For centuries, the only people who came here were fowlers from Lewis, hunting seabirds and grazing a few sheep, and even they were afraid of these islands. The men who landed here followed strict, ancient rules that had been passed down for generations. When they stepped ashore, they took off their hats and turned around sunwise, the way of the sun across the sky. They would not call the island by its name once they were on it. They did not take anything that was not theirs. They did not stay after dark. They believed the islands belonged to something older than them, and they did not want to offend it. This was the reputation of the Flannan Isles long before anyone thought to build a light there, a place you visited quickly, carefully, and left. The largest island is called Eilean Mor. In Gaelic, it means, simply, the Big Island. By the end of the 1800s, the seas around these islands were killing ships. The Atlantic approaches to the Hebrides are some of the most dangerous waters in Britain, and a dark, unmarked rock 20 miles out is a trap waiting to happen. So, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to do the near impossible. Build a lighthouse on Eilean Mor. The work fell to the Stevensons, the great family of Scottish lighthouse engineers, the same family that produced the writer Robert Louis Stevenson. Building here was brutal. Every stone, every tool, every barrel had to be hauled up sheer cliffs from a heaving boat. They cut steps and a rope railway into the rock just to move the materials. It took 4 years. And in December of 1899, the light on Eilean Mor was lit for the very first time. A tower of pale stone, 75 feet tall, its beam thrown 25 miles out to sea. One of the most isolated, hard-won lighthouses in all of Britain. It had been burning for almost exactly 1 year when the men disappeared. Keeping that light took 3 men at a time on the rock, with a 4th resting back on shore. They worked in rotation, weeks on the island, then relief by boat, weather permitting. Their families lived at a shore station on Lewis, at a village called Braesclete, and waited for them. In December of 1900, the crew out on the rock was 3 men. The first was James Ducat, the principal keeper, the man in charge. Ducat was in his 40s, steady, experienced, respected. He had a wife and 4 children waiting on Lewis. The second was Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, younger, careful, good at the hard, cold work. And the third man is where a small twist of fate enters the story. The regular assistant, a keeper named William Ross, had fallen ill and was on sick leave, so a local man was brought out to stand in for him. His name was Donald MacArthur. MacArthur was an occasional keeper, a former soldier, known around Braesclete as tough and not easily frightened. He was only supposed to be filling a gap for a few weeks. 3 ordinary men then, doing a hard, lonely job on a rock in the winter sea. None of them could have known that the roster for that December would be studied for the next 100 years. On December the 7th, 1900, the relief boat dropped the 3 men and their supplies and turned for home. That was the last time anyone saw James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, or Donald MacArthur alive. For a week, nothing seemed wrong. The light burned each night, as it was supposed to. Then came the night of December the 15th. A steamer called the Arctur was passing the islands, bound for the port of Leith. Her crew looked out for the Flannan light, the way every ship on that coast did. It was not burning. On that coast, in that weather, a lighthouse gone dark is not just strange. It is deadly. The Arctur's captain noted it. But his ship was struggling in heavy seas herself, and by some failure that was never fully explained, his report did not reach the lighthouse authorities in time. So the light on Alien Moor stayed dark night after night, and no one came. The relief boat was due anyway, around the 20th. The keepers should have been swapped out. But the sea had other plans. Storm after storm rolled in off the Atlantic. The relief was delayed, and delayed again. Christmas came and went on the mainland, with 3 keepers unaccounted for on a dark rock and no way to reach them. It was not until December the 26th, the day after Christmas, that the lighthouse tender Hesperus finally clawed her way out to the island. Her captain was a man named James Harvey, and as he approached Alien Moor, he already felt that something was wrong. There was no flag flying on the lighthouse mast. There should have been. There were no empty supply boxes left ready on the landing. There always were. And there was no keeper standing on the rocks to wave the relief boat in. There was always someone watching for the boat. Harvey sounded the ship's steam whistle across the water, long and loud. Nothing. He fired a rocket into the gray sky. Nothing answered from the island. A relief keeper named Joseph Moore was rowed to the rock and climbed the long flight of steps toward the lighthouse, alone. The iron entrance gate was closed. The main door to the lighthouse was closed. Moore opened it and stepped inside and called out. His own voice came back to him. In the kitchen, the fire in the grate was long dead. The ashes were stone cold. The clock on the wall had stopped, its spring run all the way down. It had not been wound in days. Some of the beds were unmade. A chair sat in the kitchen. And here we have to be careful, because this is where fact and legend part ways. The famous version of this story says the rescuers found a meal left untouched on the table, an overturned chair, as if the men had leapt up mid-bite and fled. Joseph Moore, the man who was actually there, described no such thing. No abandoned meal, no dramatic overturned chair frozen in place. Those details came later, from a poem, not from the record. What Moore truly found was worse in its own quiet way. An orderly lighthouse, tidied, shut up, cold, and utterly empty. He checked the bedrooms. Empty. He climbed to the light room at the top of the tower. The great lamp was clean. The wicks were trimmed. The reservoir was full of oil. Everything was ready for the light to be lit that night, by men who were no longer there. Moore searched every room, calling their names into the silence. There was no one. And then he noticed the coats. The keepers kept heavy oilskin coats and sea boots by the door, for going out onto the wet rock. 2 sets were gone, Ducats and Marshalls. But the third set of oilskins still hung on its hook, Donald MacArthur's, which meant, on a freezing day in the North Atlantic, one of the 3 men had gone outside without his coat. Moore was so shaken that he could not stay in the lighthouse alone. He went back down and brought other men up with him to search again. Together, they went over the whole island, and the island gave them their only real clue. There were 2 landing places on Alien Moor, one on the east side, one on the west. The east landing was untouched, perfectly normal. The west landing was a scene of destruction, and the west landing sits high, very high. This is the part that has never sat right with anyone. Iron railings, set into the solid rock, had been bent and twisted flat. A cast iron crane, fixed to the cliff 65 feet above the water, was wrenched and damaged. Ropes that had been carefully coiled were torn loose and flung in tangles across the rocks. A heavy wooden toolbox, stored in a crevice 110 feet above the sea, had been ripped clean out and smashed to pieces. Its contents were scattered everywhere. A single block of stone, weighing more than a ton, had been lifted and shifted out of its resting place. Turf and grass had been torn away from the cliff top, far, far above any normal waterline. Think about what that means. Whatever did this reached 100 feet up a cliff face and tore solid iron and stone apart. The sea does not climb 100 feet, not on any ordinary day. But the men who knew that coast understood something the rest of us have to be told. In the right conditions, in the right gully, the Atlantic can do exactly that. Then there were the logbooks. And this is where the legend grew its darkest branches. The keepers recorded the weather and their work first on a slate, then copied it neatly into the official log. The popular story claims those entries became a chronicle of terror. that a monstrous storm battered the island for days, that the calm, experienced Ducat went strangely silent, that the tough old soldier MacArthur, a man who feared nothing, was found weeping, that all three men were driven to their knees in prayer, and that the final line, written in a shaking hand, read simply, "God is over all." It is a genuinely chilling story. It is also almost certainly not true. Historians who went back to the actual records found serious problems with it. The weather logs on the mainland show that the seas around the islands were calm on the days in question. There was no days-long hurricane hammering Eilean Moor when the men vanished. The dramatic entries about crying and praying appear nowhere in the real surviving record. They were invented later by writers who understood that a true story with no ending leaves a hole, and people will fill that hole with a ghost. What the real log tells us is quieter and somehow more unsettling. The last entries describe ordinary work and ordinary weather. The final note was made on the morning of December the 15th, and then the record simply stops, mid-routine, on a calm day, with no warning at all. 12 years after the men disappeared, a poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a poem called Flannan Isles. In it, he imagined the rescuers stepping into the lighthouse to find a meal untasted on the table, a chair knocked over on the floor, a door swinging open on its hinges, and three great black birds perched on the rock, watching them, that seemed to carry the souls of the missing men. The poem is beautiful. It is haunting, and nearly every unforgettable detail in it is pure invention. There was no untouched meal, there was no toppled chair, there were no watching birds, but Gibson's poem traveled around the world, and it was taught in schools for generations, and slowly his invented details replaced the real ones in the public memory. The overturned chair, the abandoned dinner. Those are the things people remember about the Flannan Isles, and almost none of it happened. The mystery was strange enough on its own, but a strange truth was not enough, so the legend improved it. This is what always happens to a story that has no ending. We finish it for ourselves. So, stripping away the poems and the ghost stories, what actually happened to these three men? The official investigation was carried out by Robert Muirhead, a superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board. And this was personal for him. Muirhead had hired all three keepers himself. He went to the island, examined the wreckage at the West Landing, and reached a careful, sober conclusion. He believed the men were taken by the sea. His reconstruction goes like this. On the 15th of December, the two keepers on duty, Ducat and Marshall, saw that heavy weather was coming. They pulled on their oilskins and their sea boots and went down to the dangerous West Landing to secure the crane and the toolbox before the storm could smash them. That is why two sets of coats were missing. They were being worn. And the third man, MacArthur, the one whose coat still hung by the door? Muirhead thought MacArthur was inside when he saw, through the window, a wave of monstrous size rushing toward the two men at the landing, and that MacArthur ran out into the freezing cold, without stopping for his coat, desperate to shout a warning or drag his friends back from the edge. And that the wave, or a series of waves, swept all three of them into the sea at once. It is the most likely explanation we have. A rogue wave, a fatal act of loyalty, and terrible timing. And the science supports it more than you might think. In a narrow gully like the West Landing, the sea does not just rise. It is funneled and forced upward with enormous violence. Storm surges and freak waves in these waters have been documented, climbing far higher than anyone would believe. 100 feet is extreme, but it is not impossible. Not here. And yet, this is still only a theory. It fits, but it cannot be proven, because no bodies were ever found, not one. The sea, if it was the sea, kept all three of them, and into that gap, other explanations crept. Some pointed at MacArthur, the substitute, the outsider, the ex-soldier with a temper. They wondered about cabin fever. 3 men, 1 small rock, weeks of isolation and darkness. Could an argument have turned deadly? Could one man have killed the other 2, and then, in horror or madness, thrown himself into the sea? There is no evidence for it, but there is no evidence against it either. Others reached for stranger answers. A passing ship that took them. A sea creature. A curse on the old islands finally collected. The Flannan Isles had been feared for 1,000 years before that light was ever lit. The old fowlers could have told you not to stay there. None of these darker theories can be proven, but here is the uncomfortable truth. Neither can the wave. So here is what we are actually left with. Just the facts, laid side by side. 3 experienced keepers, men who knew that coast and that sea better than anyone alive. Gone from a locked, tidy, orderly lighthouse on a single winter day. one of them out in the freezing cold without his coat, a landing place torn apart by a force that reached impossibly high up the cliff, a lamp cleaned and ready, a clock stopped, a fire gone cold, and a logbook that ends, without drama, in the middle of an ordinary morning. The most likely answer is a wave. It probably was a wave. But probably is a very cold word to leave 3 men on. The lighthouse on Alien Moor is still there tonight. In 1971, it was automated. The last keepers were taken off, and no one has lived on that rock since. There is no one left there now to disappear. But the light still turns, all through the night, over the same black water that swallowed 3 men more than a century ago. It sweeps the sea, and the cliffs, and the ruined little chapel of the saint. And in all that time, the Atlantic has never once given them back. We know their names. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. We know they were real, and that real families waited for them on Lewis, and that they never came home. We just do not know what happened in the last hour of their lives. So if you ever sail past the 7 hunters, and you see that light turning in the dark, spare a thought for those 3 men, and for whatever it was that came up out of the sea to meet them. I release a new unsolved case like this every week. If this one stayed with you, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay close. There are so many more of these waiting in the dark. This is Storytime with Finnley. Sleep well, and keep the light burning.